conversation. And if you have an interest in creating the topics that are part of the conversation, the program committee is the one for you. And our program chair, Barbara Butterworth, is here and can chat about that. And then just one last thing, tomorrow morning, we're going to do a coffee meetup, which we've done the last 5 or 6 months, where we get together the day after our meeting and just have a completely informal, unstructured conversation. And we'll be at 8 Hands Farm at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'll be there. I'd love to have you join us. Whoever comes, whatever conversation flows. And it's a great way just to continue the conversation. So with that, let's get to this evening's conversation. I'd like to introduce Barbara Butterworth.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is a topic that is very near and dear to a lot of our hearts. And so it's wonderful to be able to share the story of land preservation in Cutchogue. Land preservation has a history. It has a process whereby land has been preserved. And it has a lot of history about the process by which land has been preserved, involving lots of different people. So we've asked 3 key people to come and join us tonight to tell us the broad and big story of land preservation in South Lake Town. Al Krupski, I think needs no introduction. He's our supervisor, and I know he's a dedicated land preservationist, and will talk to us about the history and the importance of land preservation. Lily McCullough is head of the Land Preservation Office of the town, and she'll talk about the details and the specifics of how we preserve land. And Tim Caulfield is a retired vice president at the Land Trust, and he was involved for I don't know how many years, very significantly in the land preservation process here in South Lake Town. And he's going to tell us the story about the preservation of Downs Farm, because Downs Farm is an essential part of Cutchogue here, and it's a fascinating story to hear how that happened. So, Al, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for addressing this important topic. There was, and I'm glad you highlighted Downs Farm, because Tim and I were talking, and Tim's impact on our town and our community is really monumental. And I just want you can't understate what he's done, his work and the Land Trust work has done to preserve this town. And so Downs Farm is was one of in my mind one of the early ones that kind of got the community to shift that culture from what happens to this should happen. And I think that was very an important preservation effort because of that. He's been involved, I know, with many other worthy efforts in town, so I can't say enough about it. And to have Lily here, we're really thrilled, because Lily's so capable, and there was a lot of angst when Melissa Spiral was going to retire, because she kind of built the program from nothing to a real effective land preservation program, and Lily's more than capable of that job. So we're really, as a town, we're very fortunate to have Lily on board. So the history, really, if you go back 50 years, and some of us can remember 50 years ago, if you go back 50 years, Suffolk County started the first land preservation program. It was a farmland preservation program. And if you go back to the 70s, you think about, if you lived out here, it was kind of shocking, because everyone knew somebody who lived up Island. All that farmland in Huntington, Smithtown, and Brookhaven was just paved over as fast as you could imagine. And it was really kind of what you call no planning to it. Really, it was just sprawl. You could see the impact on schools and roads and public safety. The impact was huge on everything. And Suffolk County funded a farmland preservation program 50 years ago. And I remember my grandfather and my great uncles having that conversation about, is this going to work? What is it going to do to your land equity? Who should enter the program? And they were really concerned about it. They weren't sold on it immediately as a tool. And yet they did know what was going on in Western Suffolk and Nassau and Western Suffolk. They knew the impacts of farmland. The farmland was all disappearing. So the town Southwold Town started preserving land in the eighties, and Southwold started bonding for farmland preservation. And it would be a public referendum, be like $1 million, and it would be bonded at the time. And the program started from that. There was a committee formed to vet these different proposals, and then I think it's a similar process. It was an appraisal process, and it went on from there. And as more people enter the program, and Lily's going to talk about that, I know, about the important component in the program. As more people entered it, it became more commonplace. And then the farmland that was preserved, all of a sudden there was a market for that farmland, because people wanted to buy land that was not full market value by any means, and because they wanted to farm, they wanted to grow things. So they could buy a piece of land that was way cheaper, they could afford to do it for some sort of agricultural argument. So, and I think once people saw that there was a resale market in that, some of the preserved land has gone through a number of generations of owners. And I think it's important to know that this land is preserved in perpetuity, because you don't know, believe me, in the eighties, we didn't know what agriculture would look like in the nineties. It's changed quite a bit till today. So to have that block of preserved land is what you need, that there's at least an opportunity for agriculture. So the history changed, and then we were bonding for farmland purchases. Then there was interest in open space. People said, well, what about open space? And then some of the focus shifted towards open space. There's a lot of land around Laurel Lake. That was a focus area. There's a lot of land in Pipes Neck. That was another focus area. There's also waterfront access parcels. And it's a lot of it was just opportunity, because it's a voluntary program. So you can't have the map, and I'm sorry I didn't bring the big map, and I thank someone for bringing that map on the side there. Because it shows that the preservation efforts today, but it's really an opportunity, because you can't say, I'm going to say, you need money for the program, but we're going to wait for that parcel. If that's the parcel you want to preserve, you can wait 50 years, and you can never preserve it. So it's kind of a program of opportunity based on the landowner's needs. So I think the town's been was very successful in that effort. And then and I think Lily or Tim will talk more about the CPF itself and how now the town has a steady stream of funding. I can certainly speak to how the CPF was managed, because 2006, 2007, like today, land prices went way up, shot way up. Everybody was really concerned. We're going to lose the race. This development's going to win. What are we going to do? Some towns bonded out in advance of their CPF revenues. Once the bubble burst in 2008, CPF revenues went way down. Towns that had borrowed too much had struggled just to pay the debt service on their borrowing, ended up with no program. And now you have no money, so then therefore you effectively have no program. So you're pretty much out of the race completely. And we resisted that in Southwold. We didn't want to, we didn't, I'm not saying we were that smart, we knew the bubble would burst in way, but we knew that it couldn't sustain itself. The increase in land values and everything couldn't sustain itself, and it didn't. So we kept the program alive. We don't have the revenues that the South Fork towns have, just because it's a fair formula for determining how much money we have. But we have kept the program alive and effective. As a town, we decided not to spend money on stewardship. We could have spent from the beginning. 15% of it could have gone towards stewardship. We could have hired park rangers. We could have had the offices and assistants and deputies and all that. And we resisted that and said we want every dime to go towards preservation. When it came to open space, we bought a lot of open space. And so there's no outcry for more trails. There's no point in making more trails. People are enjoying what they have. And so we were very cautious about developing a lot of open space land. And we kind of, we resisted, and then they changed the law again with another referendum for CPF. Now you can spend up to 20% of water. And it was the same argument. if you don't have that much money to spend on preservation, and if we don't have the money on hand to preserve that parcel that we really want to preserve, and if you look at the map, there's areas that are getting filled in quite nicely, and you're accumulating nice blocks of productive farmland. If you don't have the money on hand, you lose that, and it's lost forever. And then you change the impact on the community, of course, it's changed forever. If you put a housing development in the middle of a lot of preserved farmland. So we resisted spending the money on water quality projects. The town's committed for decades on water quality efforts anyway, funding it from the general fund and now bonding for it. So we keep working on water quality efforts parallel to land preservation. The two things can happen at the same time. We're not going to fund it through that because we need to dedicate, the philosophy has been to dedicate every dime towards preservation. So I could go on about that for a long time, but I'll let, if you like.
I just want to say that you'll have a question and answer at the end, so just hold your question.
I'll let Lily go on about the program itself. Oh, and I just should acknowledge one of my colleagues, Ann Smith is here, also from the town board.
I get to face on to this committee and I get to work with Lily. Very nice.
You witness the town securely. Yes, and many doors. Better access to you all. All right. So my name is Lily McCullough. I am head of the Southfield Land Preservation Department, and I'm here to talk to you about the town's program. I'm going to give you a little bit of a land preservation 101, who's involved, what land preservation is at a high level, how we fund it, and what the town has done with that funding. I'm going to be focusing more on the program's priorities and accomplishments and less on the nuts and bolts of how the land preservation application process works, but I'm of course happy to get into that if anyone's interested. I'm also going to talk about what's left to preserve in town and how you can all engage with the town's land preservation program. And I'll do my best to hit the highlights, but this is a huge and complicated topic. So, please feel free to follow up with questions either tonight or after tonight's presentation. I'm going to have my contact information up here, and I'm also going to show you some kind of useful resources to get a little more familiar with land preservation in town if you're not already. Okay, so land preservation anywhere, but in Southfield town certainly requires significant collaboration between all sorts of folks. So at the center of the circle is the landowner. As Al mentioned, land preservation is a voluntary program, so none of this happens without willing and interested landowners. There's the land preservation department. That's me. That's my hospital assistant, Preservation Oct. We are basically project managers and information gatherers. We coordinate with all the folks here to make sure that everyone has the information they need to make good decisions about land preservation policy and acquisitions. There is the Land Preservation Committee. This is a volunteer committee of 7 Southfield town residents. They advise the town board on preservation projects, on land preservation policy. There's always at least one active farmer on the committee. And they have to have experience with land conservation or preservation. Then we have potential partners in land preservation. We're not the only land preservation game in town, and we try to partner when we can to make our collective funding go as far as possible. So there's the county. The county has pretty similar ag and open space preservation programs, and we partner with them pretty often on open space acquisitions.
There's the DEC and ag and markets at the state level, sometimes considered the federal government through grant funding, and of course there are land trusts like the County Land Trust and the Henry and Ferguson Museum Land Trust that we have that use kind of similar preservation tools. We have a few different tools that towns don't have that will provide what they need. There is of course the public, all of you, and you're all really as critical as the landowner in this process. The public, in large part, guides our preservation efforts. You are responsible for authorizing the funding that we use for land preservation projects, the planning and policies that guide our acquisitions, and the acquisitions themselves. So much like this can't happen with landowners, this can't happen without the public. And then finally, the town board. They are important here because they are the ultimate decision makers. So they get information and input from all of these folks and make, sound decisions on policy and acquisitions. Okay, so what are we talking about when we're talking about land preservation? So land preservation happens when the town or some other entity or person acquires some property interests that allows the town, in this case, to restrict or dedicate the property's use in perpetuity, so placing some restriction on the property. So what do I mean by property interest? For if anyone is familiar with any lawyers, there's a metaphor, a bundle of sticks. So think of your property rights like a bundle of sticks. When you own property, you have a series of rights. These are the sticks. That includes the right to possess the property, to control the property, what happens on it, the right to exclude people from the property, the right to sell the property, etc., etc. So land preservation involves purchasing one or more of those sticks. And the town does this in primarily two ways. There are fee title purchases. So that means the town buys the entire bundle of sticks. The town is now the landowner and responsible for stewardship of the property long term. They have a deed that has restrictions. Or there are conservation easements. That's when the town purchases a stick or two. So they restrict the uses of that property, but the landowner retains possession ultimately of that property and still retains some limited uses of it. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about how we fund land preservation. The town, just within the town, we have two main sources of funding. We have the Potomac Bay Region Community Preservation Fund. I will talk about this more. This is our primary funding mechanism. There is bonding available. That's historically how we preserved land before CPF was our dedicated funding stream. And then there are other funding sources through partnerships. As I mentioned, the county has a pretty robust land preservation program. We often partner with them on our open space acquisitions. There's state and federal grant funding available for both ag and open space projects. I will say grant parameters, partner requirements, and relative levels of funding from all of these sources sometimes make it a challenge to partner, but they're great resources to leverage when we can. And then there are land trusts and private fundraising efforts. You'll hear more about this from Tim, who is absolutely the expert on this. But the private end of things is pretty critically important too. So there are land trusts which are, driven by community interests, and they leverage both private fundraising and, other grant funds that are available. And I also want to point out, there are also ways that landowners individually help. So landowners sometimes donate property or sell property through what's called a bargain sale. So they accept less than the appraised value, which they can then deduct as a charitable gift. And that's a pretty critical element of maximizing the town's value and making our money go a lot further. And that comes basically from generosity of landowners. So the Community Preservation Fund. This is our primary funding source. It was established in 1998, started collecting funding in 1999. And it was adopted and reauthorized subsequently by public referendum. It expires in 2050, so it will have to be reauthorized sometime before then. The general structure is that it's a 2% transfer tax on real estate transactions. So that means that the money is generated by property sales, not property taxes. So if you bought property in the last 25 years, you contributed to this fund most likely. The fund is kept wholly separate from the general municipal budget, and it can only be used as outlined in the CPF statute, the state law. And one of those uses is the acquisition of property interests to preserve community heritage, which I will get into. Okay, so this is what CPF in Southfield Town has looked like, you know, in the last 2 years. I tried to give you a sort of reasonable scope. So how are we faring? This is annual revenue in Southfield from 2018 to present. Special note that 2024 is obviously a projected figure. We have not yet completed the year. CPF is a real estate transfer tax, so it generally tracks the real estate market. Annual revenue, so you can see annual revenue peaked in 2021, and it's been slowing down since, but it's still a steady stream. We've collected about $6.8 million this year, January through August. And we're projected to take in a little over $9 million this year. Of course, we'll see how the rest of the months shake out. So, you know, we're below peak pandemic housing market levels, and getting to an area that looks a little closer to pre-pandemic 2018, 2019. Okay, so we have this money and the goal is to spend it. How do we do that? How do we make those decisions? So as I mentioned, CPF has a state law that guides use of the funding. The statute allows the town to acquire property interests that preserve community character, which they defined using this list. The statute also requires the town to develop and maintain the community preservation project plan, which outlines the town's priorities and policies for land preservation. The town also has to list all of the properties that it would like to preserve that meet these criteria. For reference, Southfield Town's priorities are farmland first, which is required by the CPF statute, environmentally sensitive lands, and lands for recreation and public gathering. Properties that are not on that CPF project plan are not eligible for CPF funding. And the asterisk entries here are the ones we typically use, just for reference. So parks, nature preserves, recreation areas, open space including agricultural lands, lands of exceptional scenic value, fresh and saltwater marshes, wetlands, aquifer recharge areas, undeveloped shoreline, forested land, and public access to streams, waterways, and other public lands. So this is just to give you a visual of what sorts of things we actually do when we're spending this money and what makes it what we're thinking about. In practice, the town meets these priorities that they've set out through two major categories of projects. There are agricultural purchase of development rights projects, which I'll call PDR projects or ag-PDR projects, and passive open space, which are your more nature preserve type projects. So PDR projects, for example, you know, the upper right-hand corner, that is a Tonic Land Trust project, actually, on Fortin's Lane. Our PDR program is our longest running preservation program. We've been preserving land, as I mentioned, since the 80s. So what happens in a PDR project? So the town in a PDR project is purchasing the right to restrict use of the property to agricultural production. That means growing crops and livestock for commercial purposes. It also means that we're preserving a farm. So farms are allowed to put up structures related to that agricultural production. It's not a restriction totally on development. Farms, things related to growing your farm operation are allowed. The farmer retains ownership of that land, and they have the primary stewardship responsibility for that land. In the town's opinion, in my opinion, this is a win-win-win-win. The landowner, the farmer, gets a direct injection of liquidity that they can invest in their farm operation. The town is leaving the land with an invested steward, the farmer. No one's going to care more about that land than the person who has to make a living off of it. And the town, the public, benefits from it because we are preserving farmland that is essential to the town's agricultural identity, and we are guaranteeing that its use is exclusively for agriculture. The other major category we have is passive open space or nature preserves. This is the Ruth Oliva Preserve at Dam Pond in the lower right-hand corner. That's getting lost in the woods at Dan's farm. So we accomplish these both through fee title acquisitions. The town purchases either by itself or in partnership the entire property, and they have primary stewardship responsibility. We've also purchased conservation easements, partnering with Peconic Land Trust or other conservation organizations to restrict use of the property to passive recreation. So in general, on these projects, when the project is through, the only use allowed is passive recreation. So that's hiking, bird watching, things like that. Generally, the public has access unless it's so environmentally sensitive that public access would degrade the natural resources and the reasons we preserve the property. And in general, we pursue these projects to protect sensitive natural resources, protect water quality, and provide meaningful outdoor recreation opportunities to town residents. So, what are we thinking about when we're deciding whether or not to preserve a piece of property? This is more of a visual representation, and it's a non-exhaustive list of how the town thinks about these projects. And the folks contributing to that decision are the Land Preservation Committee. They review incoming applications and make a recommendation to the town board. The town board is the ultimate decision maker, and of course the public gets to weigh in both at the planning level, when we're talking about project plans, and at the time of acquisition, there's a public hearing before every acquisition. So the threshold question is whether this property is on that CPF list. That community, has to have at least one of those elements of community character that was in that list. And that's a threshold question, but it's not the end of the inquiry. As Al mentioned, we have a steady stream of funding, but it is not endless. So we do have to, with the idea in mind that resources are limited, we need to understand the total value, and we look at these factors and others. So location, I have a little snip of the map there. All that green is preserved land. We are often looking to build on existing blocks of preservation, especially when it comes to farmland. Grouping farms together is both better for the farmers and the neighbors to those farms. Throwing a farm in the middle of the residential development, for example, is a great way to complicate life for the farmer and for the residents. So we want to maximize the benefit. So we're looking for the adjacency of preserved land. We're looking at public accessibility if it's an open space project, and it's something that should support public land. Is it something that people can get to? And we're also considering, zoning. What is the best use of this land? We're also looking at natural and scenic quality, so habitat, coastal resiliency, water quality protection. When it comes to farmland, we're thinking about soil quality. Are there unique and sensitive environments? It might be kind of hard to tell, but the trees, I'll just point to it. This is our shamanic preserve. This is a vernal pool, and if you have ever been there in the spring, you'll be overwhelmed by the sound of peepers. But it's a really remarkable thing that isn't everywhere in town, and that can go away with development in no time. Land preservation is also a pretty remarkable water quality protection tool, and important for coastal resiliency. Marshes and wetlands are very important to floodplain and storm surge protection. We're also concerned about servicing groundwater recharge areas. So these are all things that we're thinking about. The qualities of the land that we're thinking about. So after we get through all of that, we then have to also look at the appraised value and the available funding. The public benefit has to justify the value that we pay. It's a limited resource again, so it's the town's responsibility to maximize the bang for our buck, so to speak. We have to do as much good as we can with what we've got. So at the end of the day, we always come back to that question. So we understand who's involved, what we do, how we fund it. What have we done? I will say it's a little challenging to make But that's, so this is the Southwell Town protected lands map. So it's a little challenging to make out, but that's maybe a good thing, because all of those properties that are colored in are preserved in one form or another. I will say this is not all town preservation efforts, this is preservation efforts across the board from all entities. Total preservation in town is over 10,000 acres. So, you know, there's quite a lot of progress. I will point out, just to the extent you can make it out, light green, yellow, teal are all town property. So we've preserved quite a lot of farmland. Yellow are county partnerships. The county's been essential in some pretty huge pieces, especially these. This gets a little, you know, this not visually representing on a map, but gives you a sense of what the town has accomplished. So this is just what the town has done, sometimes in partnership and through our various funding opportunities, but it's broken down. We have total ag PDR projects and open space projects. The light green is across the whole town. The darker green is what's preserved in Cutchogue and New Suffolk. So the town total has preserved a little over 4,200 acres. About 3,000 of those acres are farmland, and almost 1,200 acres of open space. So this is what the town's done. It would be helpful to understand what's left. So this is in our community preservation project plan. This is from 2016, so this isn't totally up to date, but it's still a meaningful tool for getting a scope of what there is left to do. The properties highlighted in yellow are properties on the project plan that hadn't been protected as of June 2016. For reference, the town has preserved another 740 or so acres since 2016, which is a meaningful dent, but certainly much of what's yellow remains yellow. So in total, there are over 8,200 acres left to preserve in Southwell Town. About 4,800 of that are what we would consider farmland projects, and roughly 3,400 acres of open space projects. And over 7,600 of those acres are completely undeveloped, not a structure on them. And I included this just to give some scope of where this not yet protected land is. So we've got more than 8,200 acres left to preserve. And most of those acres are Cutchogue, of all the hamlets, has the most acres left to preserve, 1,500 acres. And most of that is farmland, think Oregon Road, large stretches of really meaningful, high quality farmland. So, you know, with this in mind, this was framed as, are we winning the race? I will say, I think we are ahead of the game with 10,000 acres already preserved and decades of local leadership dedicated to land preservation. Certainly, I think neighbors not too far west have not fared as well as we have. We've had leadership with foresight on these issues. There are certainly challenges. 8,200 acres, there's plenty more to do. We have to be proactive, but we also have to be judicious because money is not endless. You know, while revenue is nearing pre-pandemic levels, property values certainly aren't. So our income is decreasing a little bit, but our expenses aren't. The good news, though, is that CPF income, having that dedicated funding stream, while it may be decreasing slightly from the peak, it remains meaningful, it remains steady. And land preservation and natural resource protection remain extremely high priorities both for Southwell Town residents and for the Southwell Town Board. You know, there have been many polls done, especially related to the zoning update, land preservation and natural resource conservation, still top of mind for everybody, and that's critical because it is the public that guides the use of this funding. So what will it take to win this race? You know, I think land preservation is a mix of planning and opportunity and luck. I think it's gonna take sound management and prioritization. Going into the next fiscal year, 2025, we expect to have about $22 million available for land acquisitions, depending on how quickly existing projects move along. And that's a real pot of money to deal with, but it can go quickly if a lot of projects come in at once. I think gathering data on what's left out there is really important. We need to understand who the landowners are. We need to understand what may have changed about the natural environment. Whether we need to kind of change our priorities about what land we're protecting, what we need to add, maybe what no longer makes sense to have on the list. And we need to gather information on public interest. What do you all want to see more of in town, or do you have ideas for projects we can take on? It's also going to be pretty critical to maximize our partnerships. Work with our partners who have incredible resources. Folks are getting more and more knowledgeable as time goes on. Southwell Town was at the forefront for quite a while, but we've got a lot of partners to work with Conic Land Trust, the county, the state, all sorts of shapes of funding that will be critical. And lastly, we have to be creative and collaborative. Tim's going to talk about the efforts at Downs Farm Preserve, and I think that was a story of creative collaboration. Just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean it can't be done, so we have to keep, rely on the useful tools that we already have and know how to use, but think about how we might be able to use them or do. So, what can you all do? There are a few things. First and foremost, if anyone here has land that you think might be a good candidate for preservation, certainly reach out. Not everyone is in that position, understandably, but there's still plenty you can do. I think it's helpful to reach out either to anyone you know who might be interested in land preservation. I think it's useful to let them know what that might mean to you and to the town, and of course then you can send them my way. Or if you have a project or area in mind that you would like to maybe put some attention to for preservation, certainly reach out to me. And finally, and I think maybe this is most important and something that everyone can do, enjoy the town's land preservation efforts. Landowners who preserve in town are giving residents here a tremendous gift. So take advantage of those offerings. We are very fortunate to have the resources that we do. Visit farm stands, hike the nature trails, go bird watching. The more you enjoy that, the more meaningful a landowner's decision to preserve is going to become. So I think that's maybe the most critical element. So I'm going to see if I can get this to work. I'm just going to quickly show you a couple of resources if you would like to learn more about this and what's publicly available. We'll see what happens. Maybe I can show you. All right. Well, I will describe this. So on this, sorry. On the Southwell Town website, there is a way to see maps and trails. You can see the protected lands map that I just showed you, and there's a tremendous amount of useful information. If you use that map, you can see preservation broken down by who preserved the land, so you can see what the town has done with farmland, the county, state partners, the Conic Land Trust, etc. You can also see all of the public trails in town if you would like to visit a preferred. That's beyond just what the town offers, but it's a great resource for getting out there. And then there's the land preservation page on the town website. There you can find land preservation applications, you can find a community preservation project plan, that guiding policy document, and a series of FAQs about land preservation. And finally, here's my contact information. If you have any questions for me that I can't answer tonight, or if something pops into your head down the line, I love talking about this stuff. I run into some of you outside of working hours, and I talk about this all the time. So, I like my job and I like talking about what I do, so please reach out if you want to learn more. I'm located in the South Old Town Hall Annex. Feel free to stop by. I sit with the planning department, and I also have business cards should anyone want to take any of this stuff. And that's all I have. I'll hand it over.
Yeah,
Glad I didn't have to follow Lily.
well, thanks for having me here. I'm pleased to be here. I was asked by Barbara to join you guys tonight to talk a little bit about the Downspark Preserve project. This is, you can all recognize where we are here. That's Downspark Preserve there. I thought it might be helpful if I could take a few minutes to talk a little bit about partnership projects more generally. This is obviously a great example of conservation partnerships, and it's a great example of community conservation. But they come in all shapes and sizes. There's as many projects as there's that many ways to get the project completed. The Land Trust has for many, many years been very promoting this whole idea of public-private partnerships. We do it for a couple of important reasons. Some of them are obvious. One of them is that there's just not enough money. It's astounding to hear these numbers. 150 million, I think, has come into Southold alone, right? Since the CPF started. And we still have about half of the way to go. The land values are so high. So it's imperative that we continue to work towards finding other ways to partner and to bring additional resources to bear. The fact that every level of government has stepped up, not quite to the extent that the CPF has, but the federal government is there, the state government is there, the county government is there, and that's all good. Continuing to do that, continuing to get those programs refunded are going to be essential. And then, of course, there's the whole private sector side. I think it was in 1986, Congress passed a law to provide a tax deduction for land conservation, qualified conservation gifts. And that has been a boom to communities across the country. There are land trusts all over the country, and they are working on their own and working in partnership with government. And it's very obviously important that that continues and grows, hopefully exponentially. Another kind of obvious reason why we need to do more partnerships is because landowners, donors, members of the community are doing it right in our own community. People are stepping up and participating. Lily had mentioned bargain sales. It's a huge way for landowners to do private conservation. And every time there's a bargain sale, it adds a little bit more money back into the till to do one or two more projects. And they're doing it quite a bit, actually. Landowners, though, also are doing their own private conservation. And we do have community conservation projects going on. You guys probably are very aware of the new Suffolk Waterfront Fund project. Big project at any level. Many people in the community stepped up and contributed to make sure that that happened. There are other community projects. It can be as small as a little neighborhood project or as big as the new Suffolk Waterfront Fund project, the Deep Hole Creek project just down the road. All of those add up, and to the extent that we can highlight the way the community can participate and do more of that, I think we will contribute to reaching our goals. There are some people, I wanted to highlight the Hubbards here, within our own community who can do really big things. And it's often under the radar. It's often quiet. Many of the major conservation donors want to remain quiet or anonymous, The Hubbards are both gone now, but they did some amazing work. I didn't get the slide in here, but it started when they moved to Peconic and wanted to do something for conservation. And Anne, seeing what was going on in that corridor of Route 48 between Peconic and South Pole, and some of you may remember this, but right on Route 48, a commercial building was built, kind of where Route 48 starts narrowing down. And it was going to be a commercial motorcycle shop. And she looked at that and she said, can't we do something better here? And what she ended up doing is going out and just buying it. She bought it, and then that kicked off a series of private conservation efforts. And then they partnered with the town, and of course the land trust, we coordinated a lot of this with it. They ended up doing 25 individual lots between the area of Peconic Lane and South Pole. So what that corridor would look like today if they did not acquire those 25 lots and perpetually preserve them, you know, who knows? It would be very, very different. And there are more people like Ann and Tom in our own community. I can think of a few other major private conservation gifts, like Dam Pond. Lily showed a photograph of Dam Pond. Spectacular, one of the most important natural areas that we have in the town. When we were trying to preserve it, it was pre-CPF, and we had very little money around. So we spent a long time working with the landowner. They wanted to do 9 lots right out in the middle of Dam Pond, that beautiful picture that Lily just showed us. They had as of right 4 lots, and they were going to develop. What we ended up doing is asking the developers to donate one of those lots, very, very valuable lot, $500,000 donation. And then the land trust bought all 4, they donated 1, and then we waited. This is the years when the town didn't have any money, but it took a year or 2 for the town and the county to step up and partner and acquire that. More recently, the golf course. 142 acres in East Marion. And it was having a tough time. And golf courses all across the island, especially up west, just turned into developments. So we did spend a lot of time working with them. It was a big ticket item. It's the big ticket items that are going to be really tough for us to tackle. Appraisals were coming in at 11, 12 million. One was up at 14 million. It just wasn't going to happen without some kind of a partnership. We exhausted all of the public partnership opportunities, county and state. It just was not going to happen. But because we stuck with it, because the town board stuck with it, eventually the landowners, the club on one side and the King family on another side, agreed to take a substantial part of that. Again, $11 million project. I think the final acquisition was $5.6 million. It's still privately owned, but it's preserved forever as a public recreational resource. If it fails to be a public recreational resource, it needs to be open space, some kind of natural habitat. So those examples are out there. There's been a number of them that we've accomplished in the past, and there clearly are going to be more in the future. So reaching out to the community in bigger ways. If ever there was a community that could preserve this community, it's it here. I think the resources are there. I think we need to continue to celebrate it, highlight the people who have been involved in those big preservation efforts, and continue to highlight partnerships so that we can do more of it. This is just Tom and Ann. We were celebrating towards the end of their career when they did 20, 25 different projects like that. So back to Downs Farm Preserve. This is, if you look in the history books, if you look in the town records from way back when, it's referred to as Fort Neck, obviously because the Fort Cutchogue archaeological site is right in there on Downs Creek. Obviously, the Cutchogue people refer to it as the principal place. I'm not a historian, but my understanding is that Cutchogue comes from Cutchogue. Cutchogue means principal place. And this was downtown North Fork for many, many years, hundreds of years. So obviously a very important resource to focus on, quite a long history. The early settlers here, a series of farm families. This is where Russ can correct me. I think in the early years, for 100 years or so, different parts of the Horton family farmed it. There were at least 4 or 5 generations of the Downs family that farmed it. And then as you get into the last century, the 20th century, that's when there was a change here on the North Fork. It was constant change, of course. But in the early 1900s, it became a little bit more of a vacation spot. Vacation homes from the city started springing up. And that's when what was for a couple of hundred years, a farm family owning farmland and passing it on from one generation to the next, ownership got mixed up a little bit. And the ownership changed from a farmer owning some of this farmland to a non-farmer. It was kept in farming. The Baxters purchased it from relatives of the Downs family. And fortunately, they respected the land. They kept it in farm production. They certainly respected the cultural resources that were here, the archaeological site, but it was held in a family trust. So there's a fiduciary responsibility to maximize the value. So we had, again, this long series of owners who respected the land, but now we're in a different climate where you can't ignore the value of land. And Bill Baxter and his family wanted to do the right thing. And I think it was about in the late 1980s, 89, 90, there was a public acquisition put together. And I think it was going to be a 3-way acquisition. The town put $1 million aside, the county $1 million, and the state, and they were going to buy it, and he was in agreement with that. There was I think even a press conference, everyone was very happy, but no one signed the contract, and that created a big problem. So it did fall apart, and this landowner felt burned, rightly so, and he felt that he had to pursue his rights. So he was pursuing maximum subdivision. And fortunately, the community continued to work with Mr. Baxter, and that history of the community involvement in this goes back decades. And we did the land trust was hired by the Baxters and the town, in fact. And it's a bit dense here and a bit complicated, but I'll give you quickly the details of what happened. This is the same property, Fort Neck. It was essentially cut into 2 different ownership patterns. One was about 105 acres on the east side, bordering on Downs Creek, and the other was a 54-acre farm on the west side, bordering on Falls Creek. And when that first public acquisition fell apart, after a couple of years, the Baxter family agreed to work with us, only on the condition that they could pursue their subdivision while we were pursuing a preservation plan. We found that that's a very effective way to work on them. It's voluntary, all voluntary. So if they want to do it, they can do it. It's our job to make sure that they want to do it and make it financially feasible for them to do it. So on that basis, he agreed to let us pursue this coalition of acquisition while he pursued his 42 lot, then 16 lot, then 8 lot subdivision. He thought it was worth about $4 million in final analysis, with the market dropping down a little bit. We agreed on a $2.4 million acquisition for the 105 acres. on the east side there. Now, where, was there $2.4 million around? No, the county walked away, the state walked away, the town, thankfully, held on to their $1 million and kept it dedicated to this project. And that became the anchor for us to work on putting a new coalition together. Enter Russ McCall and the McCall family. We realized that with $1 million from the town, we could buy 51 acres. So this was just, we just used what was in front of us and what we could bring to the partnership to piece it together. We had to do a subdivision, a 3-lot subdivision. 1, 2, 3 lots. But this is a conservation subdivision, simply for the purpose of segmenting lots for conservation purposes. So the town purchased the 51 acres, which included the fort site. The county did come back, not with $1 million, but they came back to buy the development rights on the farmland piece. And then Russ stepped in to buy the lower 15 acres, and the land trust retained the conservation easement so that it can not be a major subdivision. So the whole 105 acres was preserved by bringing the county, the state, the town, private conservation, and Russ and the family put in a good amount of cash to get us up to the purchase price that we had to get to. Fast forward a year or two, when we were celebrating the preservation of Fort Cutchogue, we just called the neighboring farm, 54 acres, and said, I have no idea what your plans are, but you should just know that the partnership was put together right to the east of you. If you're interested in selling, let us know. It was farmed forever. It was owned by a developer from New York City. And they were aware of the tax law and benefits of tax deductions. So they very quickly agreed to it, and so did Russ. So we put a very similar small.
Only because they took it over time and I hadn't enough to know what it was.
That's right. Well, we offered, these are old numbers, we offered them $1 million, I think, for the 54 acres. The county was going to show up with $500,000. And it would be a bargain sale because we thought it was worth about 1.2 million. They came back to us and said, why don't we give you the barn and house up on the main road, that 3.9 acre piece? And that became the land trust's. Okay, you're good, that's why you
They didn't have a. I've been working with you and we had such a good time and had gotten so much done. That Big Panic Land Trust was located in Southampton. And we said, you guys need to be on the North Fork to make something happen over here. And so I bought the whole thing and I let the people that sold it to me give the other piece away, but they got the full price for the remainder. So basically.
However it works. Yeah, beautiful. I had that, I took a photo, I guess we didn't get that last photo in there.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. But, Russ kindly gave me a tour of this new old barn a couple of weeks ago, and wow, how spectacular that is. And we were up there on a beautiful day, I took a great shot, and what you see from there is what has been seen for hundreds of years. No development. And that's really the story, is that you can, if everyone's involved. It was the Cutchogue New Suffolk Historical Society, the Cutchogue Old House Society. A lot of people worked on this for decades to make sure that we could bring it together. And this is complicated, it's dense, but the main message is that I think the resources are here. I think there's more in this community, if ever there was a community that could really take care of itself. I think this is the community. we have what I've always said are the three kind of pillars of a good preservation strategy. Good, reasonable zoning and regulations, a whole range of voluntary conservation tools on all levels of government and private. And then we've always said at the Land Trust, most important thing is working farms. If you have a working farm, that can stay a working farm for decades. And we've always said, as the Farm Bureau has always said, a working farm is a preserved farm, at least for the time being. And it gives us all a little bit more time to get to the final result of preserving. So that's the story as I see it, Project, but I did want to give Russ an opportunity to fill in the blanks, what else, what else?
This guy deserves the credit for working most of his life to help us preserve this, and he's done a great job.
Thank you, Tim, Lily, Al. Okay, it's question time. I thought I would ask one question to just kick it off, and that is, how much does it cost? What's the value of an acre of land that does not have the development rights sold? And about how much does one pay to make that, with the development rights sold?
I could, these are old numbers, but I've worked with appraisers a lot over the years, and generally speaking, they said that the value of the development rights, an acre or a farm, is a good 70 to 80% of the value of that property. Obviously, it's a higher number for a smaller lot. If it's a single lot and you're going to take away the development potential, you've taken away 95% of the value of it. So, but every single property is different, right? Every property has to get appraised differently. If it's an acre on the Sound, it's very different from an acre in the middle of the farm. So it really depends.
But in general, it's about 70 to 80, 90% of the value is the cost the town has to pay to buy the development.
And then, as Al suggested earlier, but you're leaving value that is an asset that can appreciate. And hopefully that continues to appreciate.
And I think one of the benefits of farmland conservation program is that when you preserve the farmland, it's still in private ownership. We spend a lot of money on stewardship on publicly owned land. There's a lot of responsibility there. But when the farmland is preserved, it doesn't put any pressure on public resources. You rarely have police or fire, the school. You think of all the things like your tax bill. None of those pressures are put on the tax bill from privately owned farmland. Tim mentioned the golf course, which the Land Trust did great, and the town did great work on preserving that. The 15 years before that, the owners of Cedars Golf Course right here came to the town board and they said, 4 families own it, we don't want to see it developed. If you look at that, where the roads cut, it would be very easy to develop that. We want to see it preserved. It's in their family for a long time. It's like this cultural gem, really, Cutchogue. And we bought an easement on Cedars Golf Course because we thought that was of great value to preserve that. So it's preserved with an easement as a golf course. It was all different ways.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, as the town goes through its updated zoning process, how important a role does land preservation play in that process? Does the focus change a little bit in the context of updated zoning, or how closely are those two exercises integrated with one another?
So I think they're closely related because, when we're looking at a potential project from the land preservation end of things, if zoning says, if as a town, collectively the town has decided we think, this is a good location for a commercial district. This makes sense or hamlet density housing or something like that. Those are uses that are, relatively inconsistent with land preservation. You don't want to preserve farmland in the middle of, 15 houses. So those zoning and land preservation are related in the sense that when you're looking at zoning, when you're deciding where those sort of more special uses, the majority of land is zoned R80 or AC zoning, those are the same 2 acre zoning. And that's where a lot of our agriculture is allowed in all zones. So those two things are related, and it's a priority, as part of the zoning update. One of the things that Heather Lanza, the planning director, has been doing when she was running charrettes, which I'm sure many of you attended, she was polling the audience. What is it that you care about it across the board? Like I mentioned, land preservation was key. So there is definitely an eye toward keeping large blocks of land available for preservation when it makes sense. I will say the plan. Heather could probably give you the best, or anyone who's participated in the zoning update advisory committee meetings certainly can give you a close look at that.
Yeah, I don't think there's we haven't had recommendations yet from the consulting firm that was hired to do the zoning update. I haven't heard any suggestions on most of the land that we're looking at to preserve, whether it's open space or farmland. There has been a lot of proposed use changes. So some of the other zoning categories, there's been a lot of ideas on use changes. Some of the uses are kind of outdated. There's other things that have come up. Just recently, as an example, someone wanted to do pet daycare, and then our planning director said, "What an actual daycare?" Because it's nowhere. Our code is silent on that for all zoning categories. So new land uses come up. I don't think most of the land that we're targeting for preservation is, I haven't heard of any new suggested either restrictions on use or additions.
Yeah, I can maybe just add one component. Sorry, I can't see it. But when it comes to zoning and regulation, I'm not exactly sure where the current plans are, but for years, we advocated for incentives that are consistent with more preservation. In the early years, like when we were doing Fort Cutchogue, the town and the land trust and town planning in particular did a lot of what we called limited development, conservation subdivisions. And they're very successful because from our perspective, having preserved land and then suburbia and then preserved land and then suburbia is not ideal. So a couple of lots, a couple of house roofs next to preserved land is kind of our rural landscape. The town had then, following on that, created conservation subdivision ordinances. So it's an incentive-based regulation to promote more conservation. And then, of course, there's the other ones like ag districts, ag assessments. Those are all positive incentive-based regulations that kind of dovetail.
And that have been very successful.
And Lily, we were talking about, maybe you want to explain a little bit what a conservation.
Sure. There are standard subdivisions in town, anything over, I believe, 7 acres. Automatically you're required to preserve 60% of that land when you subdivide, and you have to cluster any residential lots on 40% of the land. But you are preserving that land at your own expense, essentially. It is just not available for development and subject to various restrictions that are outlined in the subdivision code. But if you as a landowner want to subdivide your land and you're willing, instead of preserving 60%, to preserve 75 or 80% of that land, and you're willing to reduce the lot yield by a certain percentage, either the town or some other conservation entity will pay you for that land, which is a pretty significant incentive to landowners when they are looking to get development value out of their property. So you will purchase PDR conservation easements on that open space or buy it in title. There are quite a few. We have accomplished quite a lot of preservation through the conservation subdivision program.
And the incentive for the landowner then, if you have equity in your land, you have one lot, regardless of size, when you did the conservation subdivision, now your equity is split up. You have a few lots, you have the farm, preserved farmland, and then you have the cash that you got from preserving the farmland. So your equity now as a landowner, the benefit to you is that you don't just have the land, now you have that equity is kind of a lot more liquid.
And if you put that in the broader context of the numbers we were talking about earlier, if there's 8,200 acres left unprotected, right off the bat, 60% of that in a worst case scenario will not be developed. Obviously, the program is going to continue. I believe there will be farms and land that will never get developed for decades. So it's about coming up with a slow and steady strategy, and the regulations are going to be a big part of that. 60% of 8,200 acres is a lot, and I cannot believe that everything that's left will be a standard subdivision.
I have a difficulty understanding what the meaning of 8,200 acres and you're done. That's the end. What does that mean? That all we have to do is get 8,200 acres and we're done. Done what? What's been done?
We will have preserved pretty extraordinary and rare natural resources in the form of farmland, water quality. I will say, I'm sure lots of you have noticed around our pretty extreme tides also, there are parts of the road that are completely inundated on just a sort of normal high tide these days. Preserving land around those areas helps, preserving marshland around those areas helps create some buffers. Less impervious surfacing is better for the town. I have to say, let's say we preserve all 8,200 acres or whatever is left to preserve, that doesn't mean that the work is done with that land. There is certain, what we have preserved, there's still plenty to do. There is stewardship, there is the maintenance of that land, maximizing. We now have these natural resources. Let's maximize care of them and make sure that they're doing the most they can for us.
I'm sorry, I just,
Is the 82, just to clarify, the 8,200 is the land that you identified as being eligible for preservation according to the criteria you listed.
Yes, yeah,
Not all the empty land that's out there necessarily.
correct. Not
It's just
everything.
A subsection of that meets the criteria that you talked about.
Yes, which, I will say that list is quite inclusive. I think almost everything that made sense to put on that list is on that list. So, small lots that are mostly developed or covered in asphalt or, used other ways didn't make the list, but for the most part, everything that contributes, environmentally, agriculturally made it on the list.
where is that list?
It's in the Community Preservation Project Plan. You can find that on the land preservation webpage.
Was that the slide with all of the yellow
Yes,
pencils on it?
that was the yellow map, yeah.
And that was a big ordeal when that map was made and when that list was made. People were, I think a lot of landowners were reluctant to be placed on that list. No one was quite sure what it would mean. In the end, people saw it, and they did see it as an opportunity to have different options for their property, which is there.
We live on a creek, and when we bought the house, they told us that the town owns 5 feet on both sides of the creek. Is that really true?
You would know it.
Depends, do you need any work done there, or?
No, I
There's no any problems there. No. So Southhold Town is one of the colonial patent holders. So by virtue of the Angeles patent of 1676, in this case, Governor Angeles was governor of New York then. Like many New York governors, he was very problematic to Southhold Town. And so the residents had a big problem with these coming because they were very, very, very independent, right? Sort of under the umbrella of New England government, but they didn't really want to be under the umbrella of English government. So when Governor Andrews, when the English took over New York, they said, okay, now you're and you're part of our New York colony. And so they issued a patent to the towns. In 1686, it was Governor Andrews, he went back to London and changed. And they sent Governor Dongan, and he issued patents to the other towns. So the Dongan patent, Southampton has the Dongan patent. They said that I guess the town board in Southwold walked out, they weren't interested. So compared to the Andrews patent, but by virtue of the Colonial patents, the town owns the underwater lands. So it's the underwater lands.
Oh.
We don't own the underwater. But it's a big, it turned out to be a big benefit to the town to have that sovereign right of ownership of those underwater lands. So that's
Around that.
set the rock.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank our guests very much. This has been an interesting day. I think he does not get the recognition he probably deserves. I was fortunate to have Russ and other people like him in Cutchogue, and that's why Cutchogue has among the most preserved acres of any hamlet in Southwold now. But as you can see, we have a lot that we still contribute to the pocket. So hopefully we'll all get out there and work. Okay,
Hope
thank
to
you
see
very much.
everybody tomorrow morning at 8 and 10 o'clock for more conversation with the lucky.
You only know.